Bonsoir, je suis Elisa Lachapelle de l'Action éducative, citoyenne et culturelle au Musée McCord Stewart. On behalf of the museum, I welcome you at this evening's roundtable entitled Inventing the Land, the History of Landscape Photography, presented as part of the exhibition Alexander Henderson, Art and Nature. L'événement de ce soir est diffusé en mode hybride. Donc, nous saluons les gens qui nous écoutent de la plateforme Zoom et du Facebook Live, ainsi que toutes les personnes avec nous ici ce soir au musée. Avant de vous présenter le panel de ce soir, nous souhaiterions prendre un moment afin de reconnaître que le musée McCord Stewart est situé sur un territoire fréquenté et occupé depuis des millénaires par les peuples autochtones, lequel n'a jamais été cédé par voie de traité. The Cavaliere Nation has a profound and ongoing attachment to this territory, which it calls Jojagi. Acknowledging that colonialism has had devastating consequences on First Peoples, the McCord Museum recognizes its duty to raise awareness and support continued vitality of indigenous cultures. This evening's roundtable will address landscape photography from Alexander Henderson's day to our own with Elizabeth Ann Cavaliere, Karla McManus, and Jessica Auer, experts in art history and photography. The conversation will explore visual representations of landscape as both as a political and artistic practice. It will be moderated by Zoë Tousignant, Curator of Photography at the McCord Stewart Museum. Elizabeth Ann Cavaliere is a SSHRC Post-Doctoral Fellow at Queen's University. She received her PhD in art history at Concordia University. Her interest in interdisciplinary approaches to Canadian art, photography, and history is reflected in her published writing. Karla McManus is an art historian and visual theorist who specializes in the study of photography and the environmental imaginary. Her writing and research focus on how historic and contemporary concerns from wildlife conservation to environmental disasters to anxiety about the future are visualized photographically. Jessica Auer is a Canadian photographer, filmmaker, and educator who lives and works in Iceland and teaches at Concordia University's photography department. Her work is broadly concerned with the study of landscapes as cultural sites. Her work has been presented in several museums, galleries, and festivals, such as the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the National Museum of Iceland, and the Biennale de la Photographie in Mulhouse, France. La discussion de ce soir sera suivie d'une période de questions en français et en anglais. Whether you are with us at the museum, on Facebook, or on Zoom, do not hesitate to ask your questions. J'aimerais chaleureusement remercier nos intervenants pour leur présence ce soir. I would like to warmly thank our speakers for their presence this evening. Je vous souhaite un bel échange. Et Zoé, la parole est à toi.
Merci beaucoup, Elisa. So hello to everybody. Thank you so much for coming, to you here and at home. As Elisa said, the presentations will be given in English tonight, but please don't hesitate to ask questions in French or whatever. So I think we will start. So the style of roundtable that we're doing tonight is presentations by each of the participants, and including Karla, who's in Regina. Hopefully we will get to hear from her. And then we will have a group discussion, which I will lead. So without further ado, Liz, yes, it's as you wish. Okay.
Perfect. So first, thanks, Zoe, for inviting me, for Leila and Elise for coordinating, for Jessica and Karla for what I'm sure will be wonderful presentations and discussions, and of course, the McCord, particularly Helen Simpson, for continuing to position historical photography as a really important cultural force in its moment and in ours, something that I think was so wonderfully presented and captured in the Henderson show. So I'll tell you a bit about me. Something that really underpins all of my research is this idea that nothing ever exists in a vacuum, right? Artwork circulates. It encounters new scenarios, new contexts, photographs in particular find new meanings, new audiences, new lives in albums, on gallery walls, as postcards and publications. Even artists are not vacuums, right? They talk to other people, they read, they engage, they look at other art. And so whenever you see an artwork, whenever you see a photograph, there's more than just what's occurring in the frame. There's this whole kind of intellectual history, this intellectual community that gets formed around the visual image. My research in 19th century landscape photography looks at the ways that photographs take on various functions in varying arenas, things like science or engineering or commerce, popular culture, art. And particularly with photography in the 19th century, we have so many intersecting ideas. We have the idea of settler progress, right? Resources, infrastructures, the foundations of Canada's economic identity. We have people in the land, right? The Canadians are occupying these spaces, whether they're urban spaces, whether they're, camping sites, whether they're the oceans, the trees, right? People are there. There's a new and unique visual environment that we get in the 19th century Canadian context. We get extraordinary sites. Think of Niagara Falls, right? How extraordinary would it be to encounter this new form of geography? And we also get the confluence of visual styles and traditions. Particularly in the 19th century, we have settlers coming from Europe bringing their visual traditions to the Canadian context. So we have people trained in German styles of painting, French, British, and they're all coming together and they're all talking to one another. So in teasing out these intersections, I do like to create a bit of an intellectual history, thinking about what are some of the exchanges around visual representations of the land. Today, I want to take some time to think about who photographers like Henderson were networked with, because I think it helps us to think about 19th century landscape photographs as being multifaceted. So Henderson, he was chairman of the first meeting of the Art Association of Montreal, which was held in the studio of William Notman, which would serve as a meeting and exhibition space for this association. This association would grow into what we now know as the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, but in its moment was this kind of meeting nexus of all kinds of people in the city of Montreal. So here I have Alex Henderson circled, William Notman circled, but if you read through this list of names, you'll see that there are engineers, there are financiers, people in commerce, businessmen. There's all kinds of well-to-do folks who are coming into a network through the Art Association of Montreal. William Notman, of course, whose photographic archives make up the bulk of the McCord collection, is someone who I like to describe as Canada's photographic tycoon of the 19th century, because he had this extraordinary entrepreneurial spirit. He had his fingers in many different pies, and he had an understanding of the ways that his photographs could be used and consumed in a variety of arenas: popular, professional, scientific. Now, the stated purpose of the Art Association of Montreal was, and I'm quoting from their kind of original bylaws, the encouragement of the fine arts by means of the establishment and maintenance, insofar as may be found practical, a gallery or galleries of art, and the establishment of a school of design in the city of Montreal. They were really looking to create a kind of centralized place for Canadian art, a kind of place of a meeting of minds. And I think that's really special in this moment. And in doing so, they brought together this kind of cross-section of not only Montreal's artists and photographers, but also of intellectuals, commercial elites, that led to many fruitful partnerships that intersect industry with arts. Scientists, geologists, educators, clergymen, artists, doctors, lawyers, industrialists, businessmen with photographers and painters. Now, the Art Association of Montreal also held exhibitions, and Notman further supported the association's activities by lending paintings from his own growing collection to the exhibitions and by donating photographs as prizes for the exhibitions. And of course, this would bring people like Notman and Henderson into close relationships with painters of this moment. And here, I just want to flag my buddy Otto Jacobi, who I've circled his name a few times. We'll circle back to Jacobi. Notman also produced what is loosely thought of as Canada's first art book, which was a publication of photographic reproductions of paintings. So Notman really understood the kind of popular appeal of art. And of course, in these paintings, he also included a couple of his own photographs because it's good for business and it's good for photography as a kind of growing expressive medium. And here I want to point out the underlined from nature are the Notman photographs, and I circled a couple names of painters that you might know from the Canadian context, people like C.J. Way or John Fraser. Notman also employed painters in his photographic studio. For a painter to work in a photographic studio gave them a very steady income for what most of us know being an artist is a little bit precarious. So there is this many layered relationship between photographers and painters that I'm building here. So what do these relationships between photographers, painters, businessmen, scientists, engineers, tell us about the land and about the way it was visually rendered into landscape? Well, I think quite a bit. And here I have a painting by Otto Jacobi. Jacobi was a German settler to Canada. He was a Dusseldorf-trained painter, which was a movement that was characterized by finely detailed yet very fanciful landscapes. It grew out of the German Romantic movement, and the German Romantic movement is this kind of manifestation of feelings of passion and awe in the landscape. Now, during his first decade in Canada, he was really intent on achieving a sense of accuracy in his painting, almost a kind of topographical accuracy. And photography helped Jacobi to achieve this realism that he thought would leave viewers with an even greater sense of the sublime, an even greater sense of awe in the landscapes that they were seeing. And, Notman was certainly interested in harnessing those same visual qualities in producing photographs. And here I have a Notman photograph. It's a half of a stereoscope. So a stereoscope is two images that you put side by side, and when you see them through a viewer, it creates a kind of 3D effect, like those viewfinders we all had in the 80s. I forget what they were called. And so I think that these are so visually similar, and that Notman produced one that would be easily saleable, marketable to a public general audience, indicates to me that Notman was thinking about what people wanted to see, just as much as Jacobi was thinking about photography in helping him to create this experience with the romantic and the awe and sublime. And here I want to put Henderson into the mix with Notman and Jacobi. It's suggested that Jacobi saw Notman's photograph in the second issue of Photographic Selections, that art book that Notman put together, and was so inspired by Notman's photograph that he actually went to the Falls to paint it for himself. So I think it's really wonderful, this idea that painters are being inspired by photographic qualities in this moment, and that photographers are understanding what painters are doing as having a particular popular appeal, right? That it's telling people are interested in engaging with the landscape in this kind of visual, highly visual way. Now, what I really love about this kind of juxtaposition between Notman, Jacobi, and Henderson is that while Jacobi had the wonderful capability to, you know, take a little bit of artistic license with his painting. You know, you can leave things out or you can accentuate things when you're a painter. Notman with his camera didn't actually have that opportunity. So Notman was stuck with what I think is a very unattractive birch tree going up the right side of his painting. But somehow Henderson managed to reconcile that tree in his photograph to make what I see as a much more kind of visually harmonious image. So you do get this sense of, you know, visual engagement with the landscape, the ways that painters and photographers are thinking through the same kinds of ideas. I want to show you this work, Sunrise on the Saguenay by Lucius O'Brien. It is arguably maybe one of the most famous Canadian landscape paintings of the 19th century. It was a kind of foundational work for the National Gallery, the establishment of the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. They consider it the first artwork of the National Collection. And O'Brien was a painter who painted landscapes that really examine the effect of light and atmosphere. There's this attention to detail in terms of the details of the rocks and the trees and the water, but there's also this attention to detail in the way that light refracts and reflects and creates a kind of atmosphere for the image. Often it emphasizes things like tranquility, it's calm, it's a bit like the opposite of German Romanticism, which is this kind of sublime feeling of awe, but it's romantic nonetheless. It tried to evoke a feeling. Now, curators at the National Gallery of Canada have talked about this image in light of messages of colonial progress, right? We have the smallness of man before the wonders of nature. It alludes to the kind of conquering or taking of a new nation and its wilderness. There's a natural beauty to it, but also an industrial potential that is latent in this kind of image. And so, you know, it's not just beautiful, it's not just awe-inspiring, but it comes with this underpinning of a kind of settler colonial ideology within it. Now, interestingly, Notman often made photographs specifically for Lucius O'Brien to use in the creation of new paintings. So there's a connection between these two. And here I have our O'Brien Sunrise on the Saguenay. I have two Notman photographs from the exact same vantage point, and I have our pal Henderson in the bottom left. So here again, we can see this kind of networking, this cross-contamination of ideas and visual styles that I think, you know, the juxtapositions really become enlivened when we think about the networks or conversations or ideas in which these types of photographs were produced, right? Those intersections of traditional movements within the landscape genre, the romantic or luminism, when we think about the intersections of visual representations of the land, painted, photographed, and circulated, maybe as postcards, maybe as stereoscopes or prints or in books like photographic selections. And when we think of the intersections of colonial progress and settler endeavor, that's alluded to and bolstered by visual representations like these. They commingle when we begin to kind of unravel the networked histories of images and land. And so, you know, again, I'll leave it to you to decide which one you like more. Henderson always has such a wonderful way of creating a kind of calm with his photos. Notman's are certainly much more stark, but the Notman photographs circulated widely. You know, I have a copy of one of these. You can, they're kind of almost a dime a dozen. You can get them, you can find them. And I think that attests to the kind of popular appeal of the photograph in this moment. And certainly it's an appeal that is based on the kind of prominence of these types of romantic paintings. So I'll leave you with that. I'll leave you with this smattering of visual connections.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Liz. Do we have Karla?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
She is there. She's ready.
Oh, good. Hello, everyone. Give me a moment to set up my screen.
Yes, we see you.
Okay, you see me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Hello, everyone. I wish I could be with you in person. I'm working from 2 different computers right now. So once I push this button, I won't be able to see you until I stop talking. So I hope it all goes well. Are you seeing this full screen?
Yeah.
My title? Okay, perfect. So bonjour tout le monde. J'aimerais bien dire bonjour à mes amis à Montréal. I wish I could be there, but it is a busy school semester in Regina. So today I'm going to speak to what I sort of see as the idea of inventing Canadian landscape photography, its antecedents, and where Henderson fits into all of this. So what can we say about Alexander Henderson's landscapes? This image, river between Lake Seymour and Second Lake, says much about Henderson's aesthetics and interests. Picturesque, colonial, tinged with the romantic notion of untouched wilderness ripe for the taking, it represents the idealized vision of a wealthy sportsman's tourist fantasy. As Hélène Samson, curator of the exhibition we're all here to talk about today, makes clear in her exhibition catalog, Henderson was a typical Scottish colonial who viewed the land we call today Canada through a particular lens. The Scottish love of wilderness has been most famously and poetically articulated in the writings of John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, whose love for all things wilderness bordered on misanthropy, particularly for those who were not the same color as him. Like his compatriot, Henderson's interests in conservation and hunting saw him involved in the development of the Montreal Fish and Game Protection Club in 1859. This image from his early period of photographing not only suggests the fisherman's solitary morning paddle, but also highlights the appropriation of one of the most important technologies of the Indigenous people of Canada, the canoe. Now, the canoe takes its place in the Canadian imagination very early and in the minds of the settler and the colonial subject back in Britain. This painting by the English artist Frances Anne Hopkins is often discussed as an example of early Canadian art. Her trips by canoe with her Hudson's Bay Company manager husband inspired her paintings of the voyageur routes of the fur trade during a period when the railway was slowly replacing the workhorse that was the Montreal canoe in function, if not in the imagination of viewers. Now, between 1869 and 1880, Hopkins would complete a number of her most well-known oil paintings in her studio back in England, based on sketches from those earlier trips. This work, Canoes in a Fog, Lake Superior, was exhibited at the Royal Academy in London, which helped to propel her success on the London art market, which was deeply attracted to this form of what we might call romantic realism. Now, the image of the nativized settler is one that was created by artists and performed by new settlers and tourists to Canada alike. The appropriation of the canoe, the snowshoe, the buckskin hide jacket, and the collectible image of settler colonial identity, as in Notman's famous series, Caribou Hunting, was part of the experience of becoming Canadian for many with the financial means to explore that identity. As a fellow Scotsman and friend to Henderson, Notman certainly knew what appealed to the new immigrants from the industrialized and polluted lands of Northern Britain. While Notman and Henderson came from the merchant and upper classes, many Scots were escaping poor environmental and urban conditions, low wages, increased population, which created employment competition, and lack of educational and social opportunities. The promise of cheap land, social mobility, and financial opportunity was only made sweeter by the image of picturesque nature. Here is such a picturesque vision of harmony with nature. The category of the picturesque, of course, developed in the 18th century in the writings and artwork of Reverend William Gilpin, who tautologically describes the category as, quote, that peculiar kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture. The picturesque might include a few rustic buildings, a ruin or two in the background, a body of water, or a road bordered by some textured vegetation. But most of all, it must have a good structure of foreground, middle ground, and background to give the viewer different vantages to gaze upon. Gilpin would write the book 3 essays on the picturesque beauty, on picturesque travel, and on sketching landscape. As an amateur artist, he worked in and promoted the use of watercolor, a natural, quick mark-making method easy to do in situ. He was also a traveler, promoting the touring of England and the painting of views. At the time, local travel was encouraged because of growing nationalism and restricted access to Europe because of the Napoleonic Wars. His published books, which included reproductions of his paintings and prints, and his philosophical ruminations on landscape helped to create a tourist gaze in the English reading and painting public. Of course, it is no surprise that some of this picturesque tradition would live on in the growing world of art photography, especially that of English landscape photography, that it would adopt the notion of naturalism and rural idealism. Peter Henry Emerson, photographer, physician, and theoretician, who promoted the idea of naturalistic photography, can certainly be placed in this tradition. His books, Life and Landscape on the Norfolk Broads from 1886 and Pictures of East Anglian Life from 1888 show rural and non-industrialized English life while promoting the idea of unretouched and unaltered photographs of everyday activities in nature. He saw photography as the best medium to do this through because of its expressive tonality and similarity to the human eye's ability to see, a position he would later recant. Taking inspiration from the Barbizon School, Impressionism, and the New English Art Club, Emerson showed what photography could do for the landscape. Of course, this strand of naturalism has in it an equally large dollop of romanticism for the unnamed past and for the time when peasants toiled in harmony with nature, whenever that was. While many 19th century artists of the landscape turned their eyes towards untrammeled nature ripe for exploitation, no one did it better than the Hudson River School painters. Unlike the previous image, here we're looking at a painting titled Progress, the Advance of Civilization, painted for the railway financier Charles Gould. The painter Asher B. Durand in this work extols both the vanishing wilderness and the benefits of modern civilization. The image has been described as a form of technological pastoralism, showing railway viaducts, telegraph poles, steamships, and new communities viewed from a foreground with blasted trees. The landscape is observed by 2 indigenous subjects on the left, who look on, not as beneficiaries of this new wealth, but as those left behind. Hudson River School has been understood as a response to growing industrialization in the eastern United States during the 1840s and 50s. As the country became more industrialized, these new American settlers from the land of economic recessions, coal mines, class warfare, and textile factories yearned for idyllic images of landscape. Wealthy merchants, bankers, and factory owners sought landscape paintings as representations of this new nation, the adventurous spirit of America. Armchair travelers desired paintings of a countryside they might never see. As we know from the McCord's thorough exhibition of Henderson's work, Henderson made many images for commercial sale, but one of his major commercial relationships was with the Canadian Pacific Railway. Here we have the naturalist photographic version of Durand's Advance of Civilization. The railway, while today practically dead in the West, running at best once a week for passengers, was in this period key to Western settlement and the unification of the provinces. The date of this photo is significant, of course. 1885 is the year that the last spike was driven in the coast-to-coast CPR system. This final image rather epitomizes the desire for land as the pleasure ground of the white male occupier. Such a beautiful scene of Mount Rundle, taken from Canada's first national park, founded in 1887. The mountains in the background, well composed in the center and well exposed, yet lighter than the middle ground with its darkened foliage and shadows. Finally, the foreground gives us the subject of our admiration, our male gentleman adventurer in his canoe. Sent on another trip west by the Canadian Pacific Railway, in this image, Henderson produced, as Samson well put it, and I quote, an imperious dream whose various components remain to be explored and appreciated through the prism of decoloniality. And that is our job here today. Thank you very much.
On for the discussion.
Hello, everybody. So I have less than 10 minutes, and I really want to keep us on schedule. So thank you to everybody for setting this up and also for coming here tonight. So my short presentation is a response to the Alexander Henderson exhibition from the perspective of a photographer, so a practitioner, a landscape artist, you could say, working within the realm of contemporary photography. So to begin with, I'll say that here we have two images. One is mine and one is Henderson's. I would admit that we have a lot in common, and most fundamentally that we share a deep affinity for the medium of photography and an appreciation for nature and the genre of landscape. And I do firmly believe that these forms of inspiration, art and nature, as the title of his exhibition suggests, to be the motivating force behind both of our works. Henderson and I also practice photography through a similar process, which is linked to the camera that we use. Henderson, like the photographers of his time, employed a large format camera to capture images of people and places. Likewise, I used a similar setup, a 4x5 view camera, which requires the use of a tripod, and therefore encourages the photographer to carefully compose their images. There is also a slowness to working with light-sensitive materials that generally leads to a drawn-out process where the image maker carefully considers their photograph through all stages of creation, including the time that they spend in the darkroom, or nowadays also through the scanning and printing process. From these photographs here, taken of Niagara Falls by Henderson in the 19th century and by myself in the 21st, you can perceive similar aesthetic similarities. We've done a lot of comparing already today, which is almost a coincidence. In these two photographs, if we analyze them aesthetically, we see that Henderson and I share a similar perspective, sense of scale, composition, and the use of a slow shutter speed. While much of this can be linked to the type of camera that we're using, I also want to note that my work has been highly influenced by the work of 19th century photographers. Looking at photographic works by photographers like Timothy O'Sullivan and Carlton Watkins, Notman working here in Canada, looking at these photographers was a fundamental part of my art education. However, I'm living in a completely different time in which my personal perspective has been shaped by societal changes. I've also been influenced by many other types of art and photography, particularly in the realm of contemporary social documentary, which I apply to the genre of landscape. So I'll jump into sharing a few of my works in this presentation, which reflect my own preoccupations with landscape as a female photographer working within the field of contemporary art. For example, this photograph of Niagara Falls, which is part of a greater series titled Recreational Spaces, where I examined how specific places have been altered or commodified for sightseeing. In the Henderson exhibition, we learned that he embarked on several projects, which actually Liz touched on, but also Karla mentioned, some commissioned by clients such as provincial and federal governments or railway companies to document the development of Quebecois and Canadian landscapes with the idea to celebrate colonial vision and perpetuate the notion of a Canadian landscape identity. Many of these images were also used to promote the tourism potential of the Canadian West. Throughout my work, I am more concerned with questioning notions of progress and development and increased access to remote areas and delicate regions. I'm also interested in, or you could say suspicious of, governmental and political initiatives that further alienate or centralize populations. My own views, of course, are influenced by the context of our time, very broadly framed by ideas surrounding environmental consciousness, cultural preservation, and decolonization. This photograph was made on the southern coast of Newfoundland in a town, it's written Francois, but they say something like François in Newfoundland, François. It's a town that had defied the centralization efforts of the Newfoundland resettlement program post-Confederation. My work has also taken interest in the then and now aspect of documentary photography, landscape photography, and the subjectivity of authorship within documentary storytelling. In 2014, I participated in the Chilkoot Trail Artist Residency Program, which is a 2-week residency in which artists backpack from Dyea, Alaska towards Yukon Territory. Originally used as a Tlingit First Nation trade route, the Chilkoot Trail became a settler migration route during the 1898 Klondike Gold Rush and was commonly referred to as the Stampede. Interestingly, due to developments in wet plate photography, the 1898 Gold Rush was also one of the first major world events to be documented through the medium of photography. So we have an image there by Eric Haig from 1898, and the McCord actually has more images by Haig also in their collection. So in embarking in this project, I referred to this incredible archive of 19th century photographs in order to create my own survey of contemporary life on the Chilkoot Trail, which included photographing every single person that I met along the path with a 4x5 view camera. My interpretation also included recreating scenes from Gold Rush photographs, as we see here, but by replacing the predominantly male figures with young women. So in both of these images, they were created spontaneously as I encountered groups of young women who are backpacking along the Chilkoot Trail. Edna, seen here, is a member of the Carcross-Tagish First Nation and is the only Indigenous person that I met during my 2 weeks in this residency. She is the only person who dwells on the Chilkoot Trail within the park boundaries, living in this remote area during the summertime. Her presence reminds us that this land is Indigenous territory, an area that settlers are finally acknowledging as unceded Indigenous lands. Throughout many of my projects, from recreational spaces to studies on how to view landscape, which was carried out during a residency in Banff National Park, to more recent projects such as Looking North, for which I devoted the last 6 years to in Iceland, I keep returning to the topic of tourism. I feel that these images reveal a lot about our social, political, and aesthetic attitudes towards nature and landscape. I'm interested in the colonial nature of tourism and the economic dependency which the industry perpetuates. I am also interested in the paradox of conservation efforts, attempting to preserve the same landscapes that the tourism industry seeks to exploit. And I am motivated to use photography as a means to reflect these conflicts within our society. At the same time, I grapple with these tensions myself as I reflect on my own relationship to the land and my process, which involves traveling, the ethics of representation, and sharing images of remote and fragile environments in a world where photographs can be disseminated instantly and seen out of their intended context. To conclude, I shared these photographs made around the edges of the island of Montreal. One of my older bodies of work, this series took a methodological approach to showing the constructed nature of our island environment. Highly influenced by the stylistic neutrality of the new topographics movement in photography, the idea was to record human traces of our time, but the significance of these photographs may vary from viewer to viewer and is likely to shift as these photographs move into the realm of history and are viewed from the perspective of future audiences with their own contexts and preoccupations. So I'll wrap it up now with a big thank you to everybody again, to McCord and Zoe for inviting me to share these images and some thoughts here. And hopefully we can expand on some of the ideas, the topics that I brought up, and also what Karla and Elizabeth were talking about within the discussion period. So thank you very much.
So I think we're going to take some questions from online and from you, but I thought that I could start off the discussion. I think with, oh, hi, Steph, with a more general question to each of the panelists. As you mentioned, Jessica, this roundtable was organized to, of course, to accompany the exhibition on Henderson, which includes in the title art and nature. And so these two ideas or concepts were used for the title because they represent Henderson's practice, photographic practice. They define it. And so which prompts the question for me, if we're talking about landscape photography more generally, does one of these two, are they in equal measure, or does one take precedence over the other? I think that in each of your presentations, you are both addressing these two ideas, but is it always in balance, or I'll let you answer. Maybe if you'd like to start, Liz.
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question. I like to think that any understanding of the stuff that makes up land. So you have land, which is rocks and trees and streams, and then you have landscape, or you have nature, and these are understandings of that land that have been filtered somehow, whether it's filtered through, the mechanics of the picturesque or the romantic, or whether it's filtered through ideologies of commerce and resource management, or even human enjoyment of that space. There's always this kind of mediation that takes place of that land. And so when I think of nature, I don't know whether I want to think of the like raw materials or whether nature itself is this kind of more complicated thing that actually consumes art and is consumed by these other intentions for the landscape. So I don't know if they can ever be in balance or if they are actually the same thing. Like I don't know.
Karla, would you like to?
I mean, I think that's a good summation of, our current understanding of, I guess, landscape as a concept, being informed by the idea that really it's made up of both natural components, but also all the different ideas or ideologies that we bring to it. A title for an exhibition has to be catchy and, draw the viewer. So I think that I won't critique it too much, but, there are a lot of different titles that probably could be applied to Henderson's work. And that's really informed by the curator's, understanding of that work. So I'll leave it at that.
And Jessica?
So if I put myself in Alexander Henderson's shoes, which I was doing when I was preparing my presentation as well, I would say that he would probably say that, yeah, it's a good balance of the exhibition would be a good balance of art and nature. Because as I said, I think he was sincerely inspired by nature. I see that in the work. And then he applied this, his work was very stylistic and pictorial, as Karla mentioned. And so there is this artfulness to his work. But when I talk about my own work, actually, I usually avoid the word nature as much as possible because I find it confuses people, and they often use the word nature and landscape interchangeably. And I always like to think about what I'm doing as a photographer is looking at cultural sites. So what is our relationship to nature? That is cultural. And how do we relate to places? So in terms of Henderson, I think in his time, in his way, he would have liked the title, but I wouldn't like that title for my own project.
Thank you. Does anyone have in the room? Does anyone have a burning question for the panel? Yes. Oui, bien sûr. Parce que je pense qu'il y a un micro qui s'en vient. Oui, le micro s'en vient.
Merci pour les présentations. La notion états-unienne, on peut dire nord-américaine de wilderness, a été vivement critiquée comme étant phallocentrique. Je me demandais si vous considérez que la photo de paysage est encore, au même titre que le wilderness, qui a été critiqué, mais comme la photographie de paysage, un objet phallocentrique.
Who would like to take up that question? It seems like a Karla kind of question, but maybe that's just me.
Sorry, did I understand correctly? Phallocentrism? Yes? Okay.
Yes, yes, phallocentrism.
Gendered, might we say? Is that... am I understanding the question correctly? Are we talking about gender here?
Yeah.
Je peux essayer de la traduire, mais je ne suis pas excellent en anglais.
OK.
Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui voudrait le faire?
Oui.
Si vous voulez le répéter, puis je vais traduire.
En fait, la notion de wilderness, qui est une invention pour définir certains types d'espaces, qui est une idée, a été classée comme une idée reçue de Received Wilderness Idea, a été critiquée comme étant phallocentrique par notamment Callicott et entre autres. Est-ce que la photographie de paysage s'inscrit encore dans une idée phallocentrique au même titre que le wilderness a défini les espaces comme tels?
Maybe I could jump in.
Sure.
So I think if we look at Notman and Henderson, it's men in the photographs, right? And so the wilderness is the space that we see visually inhabited by men. I don't know if I would call it phallocentric, but it is inhabited by men, but there's been a few books recently by a scholar named Colleen Skidmore who looks at the activities of women who are going out and photographing in the wilderness, particularly the Rocky Mountains. And for these women, the wilderness is a space of great freedom and femininity, because all of a sudden they don't need to be the women that they are in the cities. They can be themselves. They can participate in science. They can write. They can have relationships. And so, that it is typically a space that we associate with men and colonial domination and settlement, I think is a narrative that is slowly being rewritten now in these kind of recuperative studies of women in the 19th century who are out in the land and are photographing and writing about it. So I don't know if I don't know if that addresses your question, but it gives it another kind
La
of
réponse, c'est
perspective.
non. Dans un sens, c'est que si l'idée du wilderness ou du paysage c'est considéré comme phallocentrique, ou peut-être que ce l'est plus, c'est questionné de ces jours-ci avec des recherches. Je pense qu'il y a quelqu'un qui voudrait contribuer aussi. Okay.
I mean, I might
I was
just
just
comment.
Go for it, Karla.
Sure. That the idea of like the term phallocentrism, right, comes to us from, psychoanalysis. It's also deeply charged and gendered methodology of analysis. And I also feel that while second wave feminism might have kind of isolated women from playing a role as colonizer, I think today we don't do that anymore. I think we acknowledge that women were settlers, participated in the exploitation of land and of the oppression of indigenous people in North America. So I think that, to me, phallocentrism is not really a super relevant framework for this work, but certainly others have found it useful to employ that.
Il y avait un autre commentaire?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of bring the question back to Liz's presentation as well, and thinking about the networks that you presented to us are mostly men, right? I don't think there was any women, so I wonder if you came across any while you were looking into that.
No. No. The place where I do see these photographs circulate in kind of the realm of women is in private photographic albums, though. So you have women collecting Notmans and Hendersons and putting them alongside photographs of their children and families and domestic spaces. And so there is that kind of network. But yeah, the Art Association of Montreal was certainly, there were public talks that they gave, which might have been open to women. They were at libraries, I'm not sure. So yeah, it's not something I've really come across.
Did you want to?
Well, I'll just add that although all the samples that we saw from Liz's presentation on the Art Association, there are 4 women here talking about landscape. So things have changed quite a bit.
Do we have questions from
Je sais pas
out
si on a
there?
des questions qui viennent de l'Internet. Oui, il semblerait que oui. Donc, commentaire de Anne Jeffrey. In terms of gendered male landscape, remember both Susanna Moody and Catherine Parr, trail rider and naturalist. C'est tout? J'ai tout lu? Oui, ok.
Indeed, I think Colleen Skidmore's book talks about
Susanna
them.
Moody, for
Yes,
sure.
yes.
Yeah.
And there's Edith Watson is another example, American photographer, a bit later, early 20th century, but that traveled throughout Canada and the U.S. and documented just her and her partner, traveling in the wilderness. And well, actually, this kind of deviates into one question, or one thing that I wanted to raise with Jessica is that you make a connection between your camera and Henderson's, your technique and Henderson's. And one thing that's interesting that the show really, the exhibition really demonstrates, I think, or at least you imagine it, is the conditions in which he photographed were insane, like trucking, a view camera in the 19th century on a boat, and and so I wonder if you could talk about a little bit more of what's involved in your practice, the concrete conditions.
Yeah, so I mean, like Henderson, I also traveled to remote places and areas, like large areas where you have to carry all your things with you, like much like probably Henderson had to do. And when I decided to do the residency on the Chilkoot Trail and bring all the 4x5 equipment with me, I mean, nowadays you probably would say, well, I don't really need this camera. He didn't have a choice. That was the medium of his time. Nowadays you could say, I don't need to carry this camera, or I don't even need to do this with film. I can take a small digital camera. But it was important to me to match, the place and the reference to this time. And also it's a consistent part of my practice to do this, to take the time to make the effort. So yeah, I was carrying not only my gear, but 2 weeks worth of food and a tent. And so you can imagine it's a big load, but it's obviously doable, man or woman, you can do it. And I think, I think that's one of the beautiful parts of still, of the slowing down of that photography can still give you in this day and age. Yeah.
Something to remember in the 19th century too is that many of these photographs in more remote locations, the equipment was being carried by Indigenous guides that were hired. I don't know if that was the case for Henderson, but for a lot of the survey photographs for the CPR Railroad in the Canadian Rockies, they relied on Indigenous guides to lead them through the mountains, but also to carry that photographic equipment. So it's this kind of unseen colonialism that's happening in the making of the photograph and the taking of the place that sometimes goes unacknowledged, that labor.
I wonder if we can talk a bit more also about the uses of landscape photography. And you just mentioned the geological survey, and Karla as well. In your research, you've both explored. So what are the utilitarian, governmental, political, what are its applications in the 19th century, if you could?
Well, I mean, the most fascinating thing for me is that a photograph can often do double duty on a gallery wall and in a geological report. That very same image. And so that it has this kind of flexibility to be beautiful and descriptive at the same time is really extraordinary. So Henderson's photographs did find their way into engineering publications. So he took a lot of photographs that were used by Sandford Fleming in the making of the Intercolonial Railway that ended up in his writings. So some of you might have seen some of those photographs of bridges in the exhibition that they were then reproduced as engravings. But when we see them in the exhibition, they're in this context of art and landscape and beauty, and they're extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily, well thought through, but they also serve as these kind of scientific visual documents, and that's really wonderful. And that was a popular publication, so people were buying Sandford Fleming's book because bridges were really interesting in the 19th century as a thing, and people wanted to read and learn about them and experience them. And so that then they take on this kind of more popular commercial circulation that then makes people want to buy those photographs to keep in their private albums. So it's really kind of fascinating, these multiple and diverse lives that a single image can take. And I think Henderson, it's out of Henderson's hand, right? Once that photograph is made and given to Sandford Fleming, it's kind of out of the photographer's control, which is really interesting.
Karla, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Liz summarized it well. I think one of the important things to always remember about this kind of photography is that the studio was a place of not only portrait making, but also the purchasing of views, right, as they were called. So people would go, you know, and Henderson had his own studio in Montreal for a period of time. People would go and they could purchase copies of the images that he had produced, right? And this was very common in all photo studios, emphasizing how much photography was, as Liz put it, you know, this flexible medium that crossed between art and commerce and science and documentary at all times.
Oui, on a une question dans le public.
Merci. Thank you for your presentations. Speaking of this application of photography, I'm teaching a course right now, and it's about changing urban landscapes, and but in relation to climate change. So, in what ways could photography represent or depict or help us think of climate change? Because in the photographs that you presented, a lot of them are very similar, even if it's 100 years later. So what would be the applications of photography for changing, well, in my case, it's urban landscapes, but it could be natural landscapes too, obviously, in this context of climate change?
Yeah, I know that Karla's a specialist in this area.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about putting photography to work for promoting awareness of the problems that we're facing as a global community, then I think, you know, when I always talk about these types of images, it's all about interpretation and context. So, for example, if you wanted to show, very famously, many geographers have looked at historical images of, say, the Rocky Mountain glaciers and shown how they are melting. And so you can see literally in the comparison of those images, that transformations that's occurring. I think in terms of an urban landscape, that's really up to you to frame those images in a way that can help your students understand what we're doing when we develop our cities, and how maybe, for example, the impetus to develop colonial cities in the new world, quote unquote, in the land that's now Canada, can be understood as a destructive pattern. It's sort of up to you how you want to take that and run with it. But I would love to hear more about what you do with it.
And Jessica, do you want to address maybe in what way, if because you've looked at tourism as a practice, in what way does climate change enter your work?
I would say that climate change is like, it's in the work, but it's never, none of the works that I do are specifically about climate change. It's always kind of in the images, suggestive. For example, there was the photograph of that we saw with the figure in front of the glacier, and that picture is really in reference to all these other photos we've seen of melting glaciers. We know they're melting. We know that they're disappearing, and that photography has been used to document this change. But what I think I would like to see is as a photographer who's interested in other photographers' works is more artists dealing with like areas that are seriously affected by climate change in a way that's not journalism, that's using the mediums, like artistic mediums, not even just photography, but to really bring some of these issues into museums and to the public. Not through journalism, but through art.
Some of my favorite Henderson photographs are those photographs of ice shoves in the Montreal harbor, where the ice kind of shoots up, because I always love thinking about that 19th century attitude towards that kind of climate event. You have tiny people who climb up to the top and then pose very proudly and get their picture taken. And so these massive climate events become tourist attractions. And those photographs of those events get put onto postcards and put into magazines and circulated around. And there's this kind of great pride in Montreal as a city that's been able to kind of withstand this awful winter thing. But what's really interesting is that those ice shoves end up shaping the harbor itself and the technology that was put into place to prevent that from ever happening again. And so it's really interesting to see how the attitude changes from something of we can conquer nature, we won't let it stand in our way, to now we actually have technology in place and this event doesn't happen anymore. This, this kind of shifting perspective on those types of events and the urban environment, how it adapts to it and technologically.
If no one else, I will.
Sinon, j'ai un commentaire et une question qui viennent d'Internet. Donc, un commentaire de Hélène Sanson, donc notre ancienne conservatrice qui nous écoute. Donc, elle dit merci à ces 3 brillantes conférencières pour l'approfondissement du regard sur l'œuvre de Henderson. Donc, merci Hélène de nous écouter ce soir. On te salue. Et j'ai Jean-René Leblanc. A question for Jessica. Just from the few images from your work, I decoded some of your work as rephotography. Is that the case? And if so, is the act of rephotographing the landscape a form of decolonizing or an act of reconciliation in your work?
I wouldn't say that my photography is rephotography, because rephotography usually implies that you try to frame the exact same image that was taken before. Rather, I'm taking inspiration from archives and then creating new images in reference to those older images. In terms of how rephotography can work to decolonize, or that's something that I think I was trying to do in the Chilkoot portraits by making sure that Indigenous presence is included in the project, that it refers to the history of that place, and also play with gender roles. In the original archive from the Chilkoot Trail, we didn't see any women stampeders. We only saw women once they reached the Klondike gold fields, and they had subsidiary roles, and many of them were photographed because they were burlesque performers. So I really wanted to include women, particularly young women, into that narrative. And what that does, maybe if you only see my work, you don't make the connection. But if you see my work and then you go back to the archive, you're like, oh, where are all the women in these pictures? Or where is the Indigenous presence in these pictures? It was ignored. So I think that's the way I could do it with this project. And yeah, it would be great to talk about more works that try this as well.
I would add just one question, and maybe I think we have to wrap it up after that. But to Liz, and Karla as well, both of you have, and Jessica have done a lot of archival research, and both of you, all 3 of you, have put a lot of importance on the object in which the photograph travels. So the book, the poster, the pamphlet, and all that, and so you have this already a personal connection to archives, I think. So do you think that the Henderson exhibition or how do you feel that the trace of these objects can be kept in this kind of presentation, or beyond the archive? Can they exist in the contemporary appreciation of a 19th century photographer like Henderson?
Well, I think this exhibition is absolutely necessary, and that these archival Henderson was a self-touted landscape photographer, so I think he'd be really chuffed to see that his photographs were, in an exhibition that focused on form and those kinds of qualities. I do think it's really important to recirculate those images in ways that are publicly accessible. And so whether it's, republishing all the Henderson photographs in a big Henderson book or putting them on a gallery wall, I think people should see them. And so if that means that they are stretched from their initial context, I'm okay with that. Some people might not be, but I think it's really important. When I was walking around the exhibition upstairs, I heard someone say, "Why have I never heard of this guy before?" And so this is why this kind of exhibition is really important. If you do an exhibition of other 19th century photographers who might have been a bit more kind of documentary in their style, they might not be so chuffed, but I think it's still important to have kind of things that are up on the wall, accessible to the public, where they can learn about the history, they can learn about the images.
I would just say I haven't seen the exhibit, unfortunately, but I know that Hélène always tries to focus a section of the exhibit on books and showing the original context of the work. So I expect she's done that again. So I think that that is so important as well. And I always do like to see the representation of an image in, say, a publication, showing its relationship with text and, as much as possible, the relationship it has to the paper, the book, or the pamphlet, wherever it was reproduced. Because I think, you're right that sometimes by decontextualizing something in a gallery space, we don't get the fulsome understanding of how these images are used, as Liz pointed out earlier.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have to wrap it up, but thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and everyone at home, which we can't see. Thank you. And merci à toutes. Bon. Okay, merci beaucoup.
Okay,
And have a good
everyone.
evening. Thanks. Bye, Karla.
Bye.